and welcome to Visual Radio. Today's September 15th, 2010, and we're going to go back in time today. We have the Tin Ticket, Deborah J. Swiss. Hello, Deborah.
Hello, Joe. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome. We're going to go way back in time.
Indeed.
To the 19th century.
Yes.
Which is the 1800s. I always get that confused. But the 19th century is the 1800s, and
right.
This is an amazing book. I'm not all the way through it yet, but it is really captivating. It holds your attention.
Thank you.
So you succeeded there. What got you interested in these women that were exiled? Rolling Stones have exiles on Main Street because they were exiled out of London. These women were exiled before the Stones were exiled.
Exactly, exactly. Well, the story came to me in a most surprising way when I least expected it. 6 years ago, I went to Tasmania with the idea of writing an environmental article. And to write the article, I exaggerated a little bit and said I was an expert hiker. So I had a friend take me to the White Mountains 6 weekends in a row and learn. So I signed up for 2 wilderness treks, and between treks, I quite literally limped into a post office in Launceston, Tasmania. I survived the 80-kilometer overland trail. And standing in line in a post office was a woman in front of me, all dressed in black with long blonde hair. And she heard me talking to someone else, and she turned around and said, "You have an American accent." And she said, "Where are you from?" And I say, "Boston." And she said, "I have a story I want to tell you." Doesn't know I'm a writer. And it turns out her name is Christina Henry, a Tasmanian artist who does big art installations about the 25,000 girls and women who were sent to Australia when the British government needed girls as tamers and breeders. So in this little post office, where Christina doesn't live in this town, happened to be passing through that day, lives 2.5 hours away. In this little post office, we had a conversation, and I thought, wow, I'm not going to write an environmental article. I'm going to write about these women. And then I fell in love first with Tasmania and then with the convict women. And I thought, this has got to be a book because this is unwritten history and it's a beautiful story. So the story came to me, which makes it even more meaningful.
You never wrote the environmental article?
I never did. Okay. I got sidetracked.
Where does the name Tasmania come from?
Well, part of the reason I was interested in the story was covered up for about a century because no one wanted to know about the convict past and how modern Australia was founded. And so in 1853, just as transportation of 162,000 men, women, and children was winding down, Tasmania... 162,000 men, women, and children. The vast majority transported for crimes of poverty, stealing food, clothing, a sheep. Only 2% were violent offenders. So shipped to the other side of the world because the British government wanted to beat the French to colonize Australia because they needed timber and flax to expand the empire.
Oh, so there was an ulterior motive
Absolutely. Here. They needed bodies to colonize.
Wow.
And but once transportation was winding down, they wanted to cover up this past. So Tasmania was formerly known as Van Diemen's Land, and it was changed by, in part, major influence from Lady Jane Franklin, who was the governor's wife then of Van Diemen's Land. And they wanted to make all nice and cover it all up.
Interesting. What was Van Diemen's Land? Was Van Diemen someone that owned the land?
He was a Dutch explorer.
Ah.
Yeah. He was one of the first to step foot on land. But then once the British heard about it and Captain James Cook came around, they thought, this is a great place to expand our empire.
Now, did you go to Tasmania with a friend?
No, the first time it was my midlife crisis trip. I thought before I start paying college tuitions, I hadn't traveled in 20 years, I thought I got to go somewhere. So kind of a lunatic picks Tasmania, but well, part of the reason I went is I belong to a writers group, and we had a potluck dinner one night, and I said, I've always wanted to go to Tasmania because it has the cleanest air on the planet. It's, a matter of fact, the place by which our air quality standards are measured. And they said, well, you lunatic, you're a writer, go. You can at least, make a little money on an article, take the trip as a tax deduction. So I thought, this is my last hurrah before I'm paying college tuitions. And so that was my first trip. And I did survive the two treks, came back with some broken toes and things, but survived and loved it. And then last year, I went and stayed with descendants of the convict women who I'd gotten to know via email over 5 years.
Oh.
And they invited me and my partner, Digny Figness, perfect strangers, into their home and to follow the trail of their great-great or great-great-great-great-grandmas. And we went to little libraries and used bookstores and discovered some facts about their ancestors that they didn't know either.
Now, I have to interrupt you. Digny Figness, as some people in Boston know, is a notable songwriter who had the hit record, The Girl with the Curious Hand.
Yes.
And he was signed to Epic Records, I believe.
Columbia.
It's Columbia.
Yeah.
Same label.
Yeah.
Columbia. Different label, same company. But, so did Digny do any music down there in Tasmania?
He did. This is actually a great story. People are so warm and welcoming. One of the women, Mary Binks, who is a descendant of Bridget Mulligan, who was shipped to Van Diemen's Land for stealing a petticoat and a tin of milk after the Irish potato famine. And Mary is one of the most illustrious convict descendants. She, in 2009, was nominated for Australian Hero of the Year, a finalist, because at 73, she runs a soup kitchen for the homeless. And matter of fact, I think you're turning to her picture at the end in the photo section of the book. And Mary, before she retired, was the mayor of a very gritty town in northern Tasmania.
Wow.
And as a mayor, she was able to get Digny a bunch of gigs.
Oh, that's hilarious.
She used her influence. And he actually wrote a song about the convict girls called All for Love that had gotten some airplay in Australia. And some of the radio folks were incredibly nice and helped him get some gigs as well that enabled him to go and pay for his trip.
That is amazing. That's amazing. So these photos, while you're in Tasmania, you could find the photos and take some, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. The first stop we went, after the 23 hours it took to get there, we actually stayed with my friend Christina Honore, the artist who I had met, and we've become great friends. We went to the Cascades Female Factory, which is in Hobart. And this is
Female Factory.
Female Factory, yeah. Isn't that was a euphemism for a prison. And this is where the girls and women were first arrested for stealing food or clothing. 2 of the girls stole warm stockings. And they first have to wait 4 months inside Newgate Jail in London, where there are 300 women all crammed in together. And then they have 4 months aboard ship around the Cape of Good Hope. And the women were put on the lowest deck, just above the bilge. The animals they put on the top deck, because they wanted the animals to be alive. Then they arrive after 4 months through the heat and the stench and, sickness in Van Diemen's Land in Hobart Town, and they're marched up, and their townspeople are leering and jeering at them, to the Cascades Female Factory, where they worked as indentured servants and were assigned to local settlers for 7 or 10 years. And so we went, our first stop was, I had to go and touch the stone walls of the Cascades Female Factory. And you can see there's one stone wash tub left.
Are they still standing?
They're still standing. They're crumbling a bit. But the happy news is just this past July, at the end of the month, the Cascades Female Factory was named, along with 11 other convict sites, to the UNESCO World Heritage List. So these convict girls are now going to be standing next to, the Statue of Liberty, the Great Wall of China, for their role in founding a culture and how, convicts really helped shape a nation, the nation of Australia.
It's very strange. We have rap music coming in. I've never experienced this. It's very unnerving to me because it's just that constant bass underneath you. Oh. This is incredible. So it has been hidden. It's been
covered up.
Not only were they exiles, but then there was a big cover-up over what Great Britain did to these women.
Right.
And men.
Yes.
Because the men were shipped off to populate.
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And there were 9 men to 1 woman?
Yes.
Before the women came over?
Yes, and that was why there was kind of a push to find women, because they needed women as tamers and breeders to help populate a country. So what the British government did is to use this old piece of legislation called the Transportation Act, because slavery had ostensibly been abolished, but really they just called it something else with the
Of course.
Transportation Act. And the Transportation Act said if you commit any kind of a crime, you can be imprisoned in any colony. So this was like perfect excuse to ship them to Australia. But let's face it, in those days going to Australia, you might as well have been going to the moon. There was no way back. So they were essentially exiled for life for stealing food or clothing. And the interesting part about that story is that in 19th century Britain, prostitution was not a crime. And so a girl could either be, and there were very few jobs for women, so a girl could either be a prostitute, which was not a crime, or she could steal food and clothing. And which would I choose?
Right. Whoa.
Yeah.
Pretty heavy.
Pretty heavy. But the kind of inspirational part of the story, I asked myself, didn't anyone care about the fact that 162,000 women, men, and children were being shipped to the other side of the world really because they were desperately poor? And it was also a way to get the unsightly poor off the streets of London and Dublin.
But they must have had relatives that objected to this.
Well, if you were poor, you couldn't afford a lawyer. You know, that's a good question because the records are wonderful that still exist. I spent a couple days one day looking at who were the people who went through the Old Bailey in London on a given day who were arrested and who was transported and who not. And I looked for the day that another woman, Ludlow Tedder, who I wrote about, was a widow with 4 children. And she was transported for stealing 11 spoons in a bread basket. So I thought, well, who else was transported on that day? And if you look down the list, there was a little boy, he was 14, and he stole a couple loaves of bread for his mom. He was shipped.
Without his mom?
Without his mom. Another...
How does a parent lose a child like that forever?
I can't even imagine. As a parent of 2 myself, this is why these women grab my heartstrings. I can't even imagine. And, you know, someone else... You know, stealing pieces of meat, boys who are 12 and 13. Women stealing clothing, a cloak or a scarf. And then I looked, and there was a police officer who stole the chicken. And they actually found him cooking the chicken in his house. And he got off with a light sentence. He was just in prison and wasn't shipped. So there was great injustice for the poor. Some other folks who stole small items had lawyers who were able to get them off. But if you were poor, you really had no options. But what I was starting to say before is, did anyone care about these folks? And the answer is yes, thankfully. There was one woman, Elizabeth Gurney Fry, who was a Quaker reformer, and Quakers were the radicals of the day. And she, through an abolitionist from the U.S., heard about women who were imprisoned in Newgate jail awaiting transport, and went in and visited them. And even men didn't dare to go inside Newgate jail because they described these wild creatures who would claw at you and yell, and they smelled, and they would yell. And so Elizabeth Fry was undeterred, and with a friend went and started visiting the women. And the first day she said to them, "What would you like? What dost thou need?" And you'd think they'd say food because they were malnourished and hungry. And instead they said clean clothes. And no one had ever asked, what do you want? And so she brought in clean clothes for the women, and more importantly for all the children who were in prison with them. And then she said, what else do you want? And they said, we have a small room. We'd like our children to learn how to read so they can have a better life. And this was radical for the day. And so she met with nearly half of the transported women. She met with about 12,000 of the women who were transported.
12,000?
Yep, and brought some dignity and some hope. And the other cool thing that Elizabeth Fry did is many of the women had no skills. So she, before they were transported, gave them little sewing packets. So aboard ship, they could learn how to sew and make quilts so that they would then have a skill once they were freed. And there's a photo in the book of the only remaining quilt known to have survived called the Raja quilt.
Wow.
And it has the women's blood, sweat, and tears on them, very rough stitches, probably from when they were, stitching aboard ship. Their hands were pricked, and it's right there. And that's, I just think it's an amazing artifact of history because it kind of exhibits the theme of how one person can make a difference. And it also shows, kind of what ordinary people's lives were like during kind of the worst of times.
1841, so that quilt's going on almost 200 years old.
Yep. It comes out once a year in Sydney because
Oh.
it's so fragile. It's only out once a year. But a museum was nice enough to grant me permission to use a photograph of the quilt.
Now, do you have a website?
I do. It's www.deborahswiss.com. DEBORAHSWISS.com.
No J in the middle on the website.
No, no, no.
So just deborahswiss.com.
Mm-hmm.
And where did you get the name The Tin Ticket?
Good question. I started reading as many ship surgeons' reports as I could because I thought, what happened during the 4 months and what kind of diseases they treated? What were these girls' lives? And I found one where it mentioned that the girls had tin tickets around their neck as part of the ordering system because all the women who were shipped were assigned a number and essentially tracked. And that also, it makes for good historical research because I can follow them through, but it's also sad that these women were viewed as disposable property of the crown, just numbered. And so then I started reading Elizabeth Fry's diary, which was put together by her daughters, a couple of references to the tin ticket in Newgate Jail put around their necks with red ribbon. And it was part of the movement at the time to bring order to the rowdy prisons. And for the three women I wrote about, they passed through Newgate Jail at a time when they would have had a numbered tin ticket around their neck. And it's also allegorical for all the women who were, disposable, just the way tin was, cheap tin at the time.
And the tin ticket here is The Heroic Journey of Australia's Convict Women. Now, you had written a number of books before this. Mm-hmm. And could you go through, when did you first publish a book?
1993, I wrote a book called Women in the Work-Family Dilemma with Judy Walker, and I surveyed 900 working moms. And really, long story short, there's no easy answer. And then my second book was called Women Breaking Through, about how gender equity in the workplace. And then my last book was called The Male Mind at Work, and I interviewed executive men about what they really think about working with women. And people have said to me, how did you go from that to writing a history book, which is a good question. And the answer is, first of all, the story came to me, and secondly, there are still many elements of gender and power in this story. And one of the things that got me riled up to pull the all-nighters that enabled me to finish this book is that at the time when both men and women were shipped, society viewed that a man was capable of reform and redemption, but once a woman was bad, she was bad forever. I'm like, wait a minute, what's this about? So
women couldn't even vote.
Right, exactly.
They couldn't vote in England, right?
Exactly, no. And so, but then I thought, they were talking about if a man committed a crime, he could reform. But society at the time said once a woman in Victorian times was bad, she was evil forever. I'm like, wait a minute, what's this about?
The Wicked Witch.
Exactly. So, but the interesting part of this...
Scarlet Letter.
Exactly. The interesting part about the story is that the convict women went on to help found the most progressive society in the world at the time. Australia was the second place in the world after New Zealand that women had the right to vote. It was one of the first places to have an effective union movement. So, and at the time, 40% of Australians were descended from convicts. So these desperately poor people who were shipped to the other side of the world for crimes of poverty went on to live amazing lives, extraordinary human beings, and to found a very progressive society for the time.
Now, I hope people don't think I'm being overly nosy, but prior to the tin ticket, with this land, and you have 9 men to 1 woman, were the men pairing up with each other? Were they being hostile to each other? What was life like before the women?
Well, it was pretty wild. It was an untamed land, an untamed society. But for the men, there was a great deal of physical abuse.
With each other?
No, by their probably, but certainly by their captors. There were a few political activists who were literate male activists who were shipped along with men, and who wrote diaries that I read. And there was terrible abuse. For instance, they had to produce a certain number of bricks every day, and if they didn't, they were whipped. And So I have a convict brick at home that I got from a guy in Sydney who was renovating his house. And I think it's particularly interesting because it has a heart on it. And if you looked at this brick and you think, oh, brick is 130 years old, what's the history behind it? You think, well, it has a heart on it, so it must have been a man, stamped a heart in loving memory of his wife or his family. But no, it was a convict brick because convict men were assigned quotas to make a certain number of bricks every day. And they used symbols of cards, hearts, spades, clubs. So this poor man who made this brick with a heart was not a loving, father building a home for his children. He was a man who had been sent to the other side of the world for stealing a sheep or, coins or bread. And his daily quota required him to make a certain number of bricks with the heart motif on it. And so I think that that's just interesting artifacts of history. Another artifact that is left behind for the convict women is before many of the folks were transported, they were in Newgate jail for 4 months. So they would take a copper penny and smooth it all off, and with a small nail, a little piece of metal, stipple in little messages to their loved ones, till I meet again, or I love you, and press these into the hands of a loved one just before they were transported. And in 1995, a coin collector in the UK found a lot of these convict love tokens. Whoa. And it just, by some miracle, one of the women I write about, Anne Maloney, had left behind one of these love tokens, which he found. And it's now he's donated it to a British museum, and I have a photo in the book. And the interesting part of her story is she was shipped at 17 for stealing articles of clothing, and she put her name on it, Anne Maloney, and the date, so I know it's her, and it has 2 hearts and 2 doves. She must have had a boyfriend or a fiancé. And fast forward, by the time she's 31, she's a raging alcoholic at the female factory, and her life's not good.
How do you get to be an alcoholic at the factory? Is there alcohol readily available?
Oh, there's an underground economy going on, and there was a group called the Flash Mob, which I think was the first flash mob, which interesting part of the story, because one of the questions I asked myself is, I chose 3 survivors to write about, because in this crazy world you want to know, how do people survive? So unlike Anne, the 3 women I wrote about, Agnes, Janet, and Ludlow, survived. And one of the questions...
Agnes and
Ludlow. Ludlow.
Okay, I haven't got to Ludlow yet. Yeah.
Survived. And so one of the things I figured out is that they used humor and rebellion as a strategy to survive, just instinctively. So you think about, this gets back to the flash mob in a minute, 300 women are expected to be quiet at night and sleep in these hammocks that are jammed in. It's an overcrowded prison. And they're not supposed to talk. So there's a group of women called the Flash Mob who would arrange little events just to torment their captors, like, dancing naked under the moonlight so that the warden would be incredibly embarrassed seeing all these women. Or there's a well-documented incident where the women would start singing in unison at night, and the warden would come down from his quarters and try to shush them, but just before he arrived, they would all stop in unison. And he couldn't punish 300 women because they're in solidarity. He'd go back to his quarters and they'd start singing again. And at night, there are documented incidents where they would somehow get scarves smuggled into them and put on scarves and earrings. And these women with shaved heads, malnourished, pockmarked, would make themselves beautiful and sing and dance and put on plays. And part of that was when they would work for settlers, they'd figure out ways to smuggle in liquor and gin and the corrupt prison economy. And there was also an elaborate scheme, which is my favorite one of all, of with a corrupt warden, they arranged a scheme where they would smuggle in a chicken with love letters, and in return, one of the wardens would get a chicken for his family. And this is how they communicated with their lovers in Hobart Town.
Oh,
They'd
wow.
smuggle a love letter and a chicken. I think that's brilliant. These desperately poor women managed to have fun, to support one another with the concept of mateships, to have some humor and rebellion, and to many of them fall in love and marry freed convict men and to raise beautiful families.
One thinks of dancing women in the moonlight naked, that they would be whipped if caught.
Right.
So they took a major risk.
Yeah, they did. They did.
Back to before the book, before you wrote it, well, before the point in the book. Hear the song?
I do. I hear.
I left my phone on.
We're being serenaded.
Frankie Valli singing "Sunny."
Nice.
But when there were 9 men to 1 woman, women were at great risk.
They were women who were transported. It was very scary times. Sometimes before they even made it to the prison, they were grabbed by men, or they would bribe a ship captain with a bottle. So when you think about what these women had to endure.
Well, at one point there was probably no women, right? It was all men.
Exactly.
So you
This
figure,
was
what
the
are the
Wild
guys
West.
boxing each other, or shootouts, or whatever, or a lot of rage, maybe.
Right, a lot of rage.
And then you have women streaming over slowly, so the initial women are almost like pawns on a chessboard.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so they must have suffered great. At least Agnes and Janet at least had predecessors that paved the way,
exactly.
and it wasn't as violent.
Exactly, exactly.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, Agnes has an incredible love story that her descendants were so happy to share with me. She was shipped at 15 for stealing warm stockings. She was a young girl. And
I mean, 15 is...
Yeah. Very young. And she actually was a ballad singer. It listed in her court record she was a ballad singer in Glasgow, Scotland. And so she would sing for pennies along the Glasgow Green. And very exuberant young women. She could not be tamed. They would send her out to settlers, and she'd run away many times because you work 7 days a week, and it was actually slightly easier to be back at the prison because you were just at the wash tubs and you had a day off. She was untamed. She kept running away from the people who were her masters. For whatever reason, I don't know. She perhaps maybe was abused, sadly. So they
in Tasmania?
In Tasmania. So they sent her to the center of Tasmania, a little place called Oatlands, which I visited last year and is still the middle of nowhere. You drive 100 miles to get there and there's nothing there, wide open space. And they send her to work for a settler there. And one night she's looking out a window and sees a man named William William Roberts riding through the center of town waving his certificate of freedom. He was a freed convict. He received his certificate of freedom, so got drunk, got on a wild horse. Them ultimately fell in love and married and had a beautiful family and settled on the goldfields in mainland Australia.
How old was she then when she married?
She was 21.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, whoa. But at least she was a young lady and she survived, like you said.
She did survive.
And she had a happy life.
She did.
Now, where is Tasmania as far as how far from the mainland?
It is about 1,000 miles. It's
real no man's land.
It's a no man's land. It's an island. It's an island state off the southeast coast of Melbourne. And today there's a ferry that goes back and forth. But
even 1,000 miles, a ferry.
There's
how long
no
does
way.
a ferry take?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a long way. But at the time, there was no ferry. There was, today there's a ferry. But when you think about the girls imprisoned and sent to Van Diemen's Land at the time, this was an island in the middle of nowhere, shark-infested waters. There was no way to escape.
And what is it to New York? 400 miles, I think?
Something like that.
If it's 400 miles to New York, maybe it's 200, but I think it's 400. You go back, forth, and then halfway. That's 1,000 miles.
Yep.
So there's no canoe you can take.
No.
There's nothing. I mean, it's probably easier for Cuba to get to Florida, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, and across the Bass Strait, which is just very rough water, so there was no escape.
They were there.
They were there. Yep.
Whoa.
There was no escape.
And how big is Tasmania?
It's about the size of West Virginia.
Oh, so it's rather large. It's not Rhode Island.
No, but it's interesting. It's less than 500,000 people, so it's still wide open, beautiful space.
Still today. Mm-hmm. Did you fly into it? Does it have an airport?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay,
we did.
Cool.
Yeah, it's once you fly to mainland Australia, to Sydney, to Melbourne, and then to Hobart. So it was 23 hours to get there, but well worth it.
23 hours. You spend a whole day just getting there and a whole day coming home.
Exactly. But Australian people warm and time. particularly in Tasmania.
And a kinder, gentler time is really needed these
Yes,
days.
yes.
Because we've gotten so, this book does take you back, and you're thinking like, whoa, there's treachery,
Yes.
there's evil, there's darkness, but there's also brightness. There's there's something about the older, it's an important work. It really is, Deborah.
Thank you.
I haven't completed it yet, but this is an important work, and it reads very well. Have you done any interviews prior to this? Is this one of the first?
This is one of the first.
Because the book's not out till October.
It's out October 5th, so you're part of my launch, Joe.
We're getting a preview of a really extraordinary, great book. It is your, is it your fourth or your seventh?
My fourth book, and I've written a few chapters in other books, but my fourth book.
What chapters and other books have you written?
I wrote a chapter in a book called Shared Purpose, and I wrote an article called Can What's Good for Families Be Good for Business? Because work-life balance is another one of my interests, having lived that as working mom with 2 children. So.
Wow.
Yeah, this book took the longest of any. It was 6.5 years of research, mostly through original records, and particularly as an American writing about an Australian subject, I wanted to make sure that I got it right. And I also discovered things like, misspellings in records, misspelled names and things, and so I went back to original sources, and in fact the Tasmanian newspapers really didn't have anything much to do but write about convicts, so there are wonderful articles that are written about the convict girls, and I went back to those original sources, which were very interesting. Had to be transcribed, but very interesting to read. Yes, yes. And matter of fact, all the records of the girls are now the handwritten records are online. So it's really...
they're online now?
Yes, they are now, which is wonderful. And what's interesting is when you look at the records of the girls, I know the color of their lives.
So you don't mind me throwing ideas at you?
No.
Who's invading Australia very soon?
Oprah.
Oprah is invading Australia. What a marvelous book for a woman like Oprah, because Oprah was in The Color Purple, right?
Yes.
And so she should really be able to relate to this kind of survivor story.
Well, I'm thinking people could read, it's a 23-hour flight, they could read the book on the flight over.
The publisher really should contact Oprah and say, hey, because this is this will get them prepared for the history of Australia. They'd have something to talk about.
If that happens, Joe, we'll have to put you on the plane with me.
Oh, that
happens.
I don't know if I could sit on a plane for 23 hours. Visual radio on the road, the other side of the world. But I know people in Australia. There's a label there called Australian Sun Records. They have an album by Audio Scam, which is a great band of fellows who play this Hendrix-style ABBA. It's a tribute to ABBA. And Australian Sun Records, and you know the didgeridoo?
Yes.
So Dave Hudson's one of the proponents of the didgeridoo. He played with Yanni.
Yeah.
So he is one of the artists on Australian Sun Records. He's one of the principals, actually. So I know a bit about Australia, too. And so Digny could have fun down there with the Australian Sun people.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm hoping, if all goes according to plan, I'd love to write something about the Aboriginal folks. I would love to spend the original Australians.
So now my next question is, you've had books, your previous books, did they get published in other languages?
A couple of them did, yeah.
For example?
The Male Mind at Work got translated into Chinese and Spanish. And the funniest part about the Chinese translation is a friend of mine read it. And I don't know if it was, you have to see humor, I don't know if it was an entirely accurate translation, but it's out there.
And is the do they change the titles on you? Or?
Not purposely, but sometimes something is in translation. Some things are lost in translation.
Do you get copies of them?
I do.
So
I do. I have some. I can't read them, but I have copies on my bookshelf.
Oh, it's your work.
Absolutely.
It must be a thrill to know that over in another world, this book. You know.
Hopefully.
Well, this would be a good one. I think a good candidate to have different, German and French. I think people certainly want to know about the British Empire.
Right.
And especially, I think you've touched on a number of different things here. The fact that it was censored and banned.
Yes.
The information.
Yes. and covered up for so long, and and how history keeps repeating itself. I mean, when you think about people today who are trafficked around the world and abused and enslaved, I have this sense that I'd love to have somebody think about how we can right some of these injustices, how one person can make a difference.
It's very difficult, and the reason today you'd think we'd be so much more enlightened,
yes.
and we'd be green, and we take our plastic and recycle it. You would think in this enlightened world there would be less bigotry and hatred and oppression.
Right.
But because you have so many people, again, it's that surplus of people.
Right.
I mean, I just see cannibalism and all sorts of stuff as not being in trafficking of body parts.
Right.
Not that far off in our future, and we really have to stem it right now.
Right, and I think, I also fell in love with Elizabeth Gurney Fry. She was a very complex woman, and it's interesting, she was a working mom. She had 11 kids, and she was criticized in the London press in the 1800s for being a working mom and leaving her children with a babysitter. So things never change. But what I love about her story is how one person can make a difference. And she was actually the first woman to testify before Parliament and said, what are we doing? We're just making these people angrier, rather than educating and teaching this skill, we're making these folks angrier. And I think, the message that still, inspires me, usually I'm sick of a book topic by now, and I still love these women, is, the theme of humans' capacity for resiliency. And I still ask myself, how do these folks survive the worst kinds of abuse you can imagine, and where do they find that kernel of humanity that enabled them to go on another day? And I really admire these women who are heroic, and they didn't lose their humanness times. And I think that's a beautiful theme.
It really is. When a woman is criticized in the press and she has 11 children, one wonders if the powers that be might not have influence over the press.
Right, exactly.
And it's a form of censorship.
Exactly, exactly.
You hear so many people, they pontificate, we don't censor, but they do. They do things that censor, and then they're out there in the public. And I'm talking about politicians and public figures that do this all the time today.
Right. Well, it's interesting, Joe, you raised censorship. The first time Elizabeth Fry went to Newgate Jail, the turnkey tried to hold her back. Said, you don't want to go in there. They'll steal your jewelry, your clothing. And they didn't want her to see what was going on. And what happened is, she was undeterred. She was going to go in. Is that they were amazed that the women quieted because someone spoke to them. She brought dignity where none had ever existed. And then it almost became like a public spectacle. People would pay to watch her reading to the prisoners. And she was reading the Bible. She could have been reading Shakespeare. It didn't matter. But she was kind to the women. She brought them clothing. And that's all it took to give them the little ray of hope that helped a lot of the girls, certainly the women I wrote about, get through the 4 months imprisonment and give them the hope that they could make it through and come out a great human being on the other end of their enslavement.
It's been my experience, Deborah, that people in positions of power want to be the only voice.
Right, exactly.
I'm not going to digress too much, even though our subtitle is digression. Sunday, I was doing a little activism work for public access TV. We have a problem in one of the cities where they censor. So I went with my flyers and said, hockey is censored in this city. And I went to, the mayor was doing a ribbon cutting right up the street. And I'm there with my flyers, and someone came, you're at a private ceremony. And I said, excuse me? We're out at the football field. This is very public. The entire public is invited. And there is a First Amendment in this country. And I said, do you even read my flyer? He goes, don't you like sports? I said, yeah, I'm the hockey guy, and the hockey show's been censored. Oh. And then, but I'm not an elected official. And then first he thought I was an upstart renegade, and then it was like, and I said, thank you. And I went on, and I continued to pass my, but isn't it amazing? And the fire department were there, and people were like, we got to shut this guy up. The mayor's cutting the ribbon. How dare you?
Right.
A sacred moment. It's like, no, this is the moment when people need to speak up.
Absolutely. You're telling that story reminds me that the book ends with the Eureka Rebellion, which is the birth of democracy in Australia. And that was their version of taxation without representation, a big revolt. When you said rebellion or revolt, it made me think about them. And two of the women I read about settled near the site of the Eureka Rebellion, and one of them actually witnessed it. And
in what year?
This was in 1868. And what the deal was that a lot of convicts went to the goldfields of Australia because you could blend in, you could hide your convict past and hopefully make a living for your family. And but the miners were charged astronomical mining fees even if they didn't discover gold. And what are you going to do? And they were beaten and whipped. And so there was a big miners' revolt where they put up the Southern Cross flag. And some radical Irish guy, Peter Lawler, stood up and said, you know, we swear before the Southern Cross, you know, that we will fight for miners' rights. And they won. And shortly after that, they rescinded these astronomical fees. Men were given the right to vote. Unions were approved. And this one was kind of one of the sparks that set off the formation of one of the most progressive societies in the world at the time. So when you talked about, you know, rebellion and revolt, it made me think, you know, again, history keeps repeating itself.
Well, I only
speaking up for rights. It's just a universal theme.
I only brought up that little digression to show that 142 years later, people in positions of power tend to abuse them.
Yes.
And in the communities, you have this, there's a big specter hanging over the head of public access, which is the big cable providers would like to see it go away.
Well, that's too bad.
Well, you know, the little 70 cents you pay a month for your franchise fee. Right. I don't know if you see in your cable bill, you pay a little 70-cent fee. At least I do in Medford, where I live. The cable providers see that and say, well, that's millions of dollars. We want that. And it's like, it's pennies on the dollar compared to the $166 you're getting a month.
Right.
But they're greedy.
Right.
And this is a great little forum for kids to learn cameras and for someone like you to come on and talk about the world that you experienced to this world. Mm-hmm. This is real underground media, I think.
Well, this is then the perfect launch for
it is.
the rebels.
And, you know, and the fact that, we're syndicated on a lot of stations, and then you're going up to do Kate Genovese's great table talk in a few minutes. And that's another, you know, and that's Woburn High School. And they have a wonderful facility, too. So it's good that you're getting to see these places that these women, these poor women, didn't have this opportunity to say, hey, this is an injustice.
Right.
I mean, it really is crazy that the punishment did not fit the crime.
Absolutely, it did not in any way. I mean,
that's one of the themes of your book, actually.
Yeah, crimes against humanity. And yet the capacity for survival is remarkable.
And you tell it in a really great way. It really just rolls off the page, and it's a spellbinding story. How did you decide what to put in and what not?
Oh, that's why it took me so long after 6.5 years, because I thought, you know, a lot of the history books that have been written about convicts, but mostly about Australians, are mostly facts and figures, but that doesn't, I think, tell the story. And so I started contacting different descendants, because 1 in 5 Australians are descended from these folks. And
1 in 5?
1 in 5, and 2 million folks from the UK. So I started contacting descendants, and I had to find people who had done some of the preliminary research and who had good stories to tell. And I first fell in love with Agnes Macmillan, who, you know, was out on the streets at age 12, found protection with her best friend, Janet Houston, this wild redhead. And Janet collected pennies on the street while Agnes sang. And they protected one another and saved one another from a life of prostitution. And from a little shop in Kilmarnock, Scotland, they stole stockings and braces from a shop known as Rankin's. And in terms of how I chose the details and telling through the daily life, they were so well documented that Agnes's police report says the reason she got caught is she forgot to take the tag off her stockings. This naive young girl, you know, left the tags on her stocking. So I thought, I have to write about these two women because the theme of women's friendship, and they saw each other through the worst of times. And then I met another family, Ludlow Tedder's descendants, and it turns out Ludlow was at the Cascades Female Factory at the same time as Agnes and Janet. And they knew one another. And I thought, this is, out of the 25,000 women, this is a miracle that I found 3 who were there at the same time. And then the story just grew. And I started going back and finding records through obituaries and their original records, and the descendants helped me, and I thought, and it kind of took on a life of its own, but I had a lot of missteps along the way. Because at first when I started writing it, some friends said, geez, Deborah, this could be a downer. You know, we've got to find the humor. So then I thought, well, where was the humor? And there was humor. When these girls were on the streets of Glasgow, they went to the Glasgow Fair, and the wealthy folks all left town, and this was a fair for the poor folks and the working people, and penny theaters. And for a penny, you could steal a penny. You could get into the